Bien, mesdames et messieurs, nous remercions Sylvie et moi, Dominique et Antoine qui nous ont invités a ce colloque passionnant e voi perdonerete un italiano che parla inglese e francese. Ouais. On August 28, 1928, at the International Congress of Orientalists held at Oxford, Archibald Henry Sayce, 83 years old, read a paper devoted retrospectively to the beginning of cuneiform studies. In the archive of the Oxford Queen's College, we have recently discovered the manuscript of this text that had remained unpublished. It is titled The Heroic Age of Assyriology. Sayce begins his lecture by explaining that heroic age of Assyriology is an expression used in a letter that Jules Hopper sent to him a year or two before his death. I have borrowed the title of my paper from Professor Hopper. A year or two before his death, in a letter to me, he described the two of us as the last survivors of the heroic age of Assyriology. The phrase, perhaps, was not strictly correct, since I was a latecomer into the field, like Professor Schrader, who, however, had died before the letter was written, and Sayce mistakenly writes before instead of after, because Schrader died in 1908 and Hopper in 1905. Sayce adds some notations about his own beginnings in Assyriology and about Hopper, who complained that Smith never read anything except his own publications, which meant that he did not read what Hopper wrote. And about George Smith, who replied that it would be much better if the Assyriologists, instead of writing books and articles themselves, would read the tablets, adding that there is only one way of becoming an Assyriologist, and that is to copy. In Sayce's passive correspondence kept at Oxford in the Bodleian Library, there are only two letters from Hopper, the first one dated 1975 and the second one dated 1977. Both are written in English. In a while we will see them in detail. Since these two letters are from the second half of the 70s, it follows that Sayce and Hopper were in correspondence with each other for at least almost 30 years. However, we cannot say whether regularly or occasionally. During the preparation of this paper, we wondered whether any letters sent by Sayce to Hopper still exist. Now, after the paper by Brigitte, Cécile, and Emma, we know at least a first answer. Let's now give a look at the first letter by Hopper, written from Paris, 19 Rue Mazarine, on June 75, therefore exactly 150 years ago. Its first part includes a complaint, since Sayce has not quoted Hopper's works in his article titled The Languages of the Cuneiform Inscription of Elam and Media, but he has rather quoted François Lenormand as the only authority on this subject. Hopper writes, I have seen a paper of yours on the Susa inscriptions. I gave to the Paris Congress a paper on the Susa subject, but more precisely explaining the Susian texts. I have been astonished that you published a list of the Median alphabet without stating that the most considerable part of the syllabary have been explained in the same manner in my Expédition de Mésopotamie 2. I should feel very obliged to you if you would, in another paper, quote my claim on the median, which I exposed 17 years ago in 1958. Since that time, I have never neglected the median inscriptions. But the second part of this letter from Hopper is probably more interesting, as it mentions his controversy with Joseph Halévy and announces his famous article, Sumérien ou rien, in press in the Journal Asiatique. Here, the idea of forming a united front against Halévy and thus minimizing minor disagreements between Hopper himself and Sayce, is expressed in an ecastic manner. You have read perhaps my paper on the Sumerian. He makes reference to the first étude sumérienne, titled Sumérienne ou Akkadienne. All impartial persons who read my paper had accepted my reasons, which I believe are peremptory. But there is now a second article going through the proofs, entitled Sumérien ou rien. This is a reply to the stupid paper by Halevi, references to Observation critique sur les prétendus Touraniens de la Babylonie, journal asiatique. I quite agree with your views to neglect our minor dissensions and to join ourselves against the common enemy. Monsieur Halevi is footing on an inconsiderate expression of Smith, who is master in such things, as he has no sound views in history, notwithstanding his great acquaintance with the texts themselves. Smith says that there were no evidence in this text to admit a Semitic invasion. You know the impossibility to persuade Smith that other people also can discover anything whatever. Similarly, Hopper's second letter, written 2 years later in Belfast, Ireland, on the one hand show how distant his scientific views may have been from Sayce, but on the other confirms that Hopper wanted to keep Sayce on his side in various controversies. For instance, Sayce thought that the new and ongoing Assyriological discoveries were of great importance for understanding the Bible. About Sayce's recent review of Hopper's essay Die Daten der Genesis, appeared in 1977, Hopper writes, I am afraid that you have not been aware of the real point of controversy. It is not the question what Assyriology, as it is now, has to deal with it. The question is whether the biblical statements, so consistent in themselves, can be shaken by the scanty cuneiform statements we dispose of. I think not. And as I expose the matter for the first time in a mathematical manner, many persons have been convinced of the fact that there must be a gap in the eponyms, and that the eclipse can possibly only be that of June 13, 808. I have, I think, quite victoriously overthrown Schrader's unsound hypothesis, and, my dear friend, no illusion on that point. Although I wrote also in Germany against Alfred von Gutschmidt, I see very German periodicals that, at least there, and also in France, there is no belief at all in the historical results of Assyriology. In Germany also, as in France, a great deal of persons believe in Halevi's insanities. The very same who once heard critics who attacked the Semitism of the Assyrian language now hear, with applause, the Halevitic, and then there is a word that we are unable to read, something written by Halevi, which imposed to us, notwithstanding our will, forcibly on the Semitism of the writing. What emerges from the correspondence between Hopper and Sayce is confirmed by the latter's autobiography. Sayce, in this book, mentions Hopper 3 times. Sayce says that he began to study the cuneiform in Hopper's book, as you see in our school day, etc. Sayce also writes that a few of the intact cuneiform tablets from Tell el-Amarna were purchased by an agent of the Louvre and sent to Paris. There, in Paris, Hopper pronounced the pieces to be forgeries. After Hopper, whom Sayce labeled as an old and blind man, made this declaration, the Louvre did not purchase anymore. I quote apart, most of the tablets were thrown into sacks and carried on donkey back to Echimim. There, Monsieur Freinet, the French manager of the Flour Mills, who acted as an agent of the Louvre, bought a few, thinking, as he told me, that they might turn out to be of interest. And one of these was sent to the Louvre and shown to Oppert, the professor of Assyriology. Oppert was old and blind and pronounced it to be a forgery. The result was that no more were purchased by Freinet. The tablets were again carried on donkey back along the banks of the Nile and finally found their way to Luxor. The same episode had been recalled by Sayce before in his article of 1917. Oppert's own version of the facts appears in his 88 article Les tablettes de Tel Amarn, published in the Compte Rendu des Séances de l'Académie des Inscriptions et des Belles Lettres. Oppert wrote, on ne peut juger la valeur d'une collection qu'on n'a pas vue. Mais cet empêchement n'existe pas pour les personnes qui se trouvent sur place et qui peuvent seules décider la question, se rattachant surtout au lieu de provenance et aux circonstances qui accompagnent la découverte. Nous ne pouvons pas supprimer les regrets que l'École française du Caire n'ait pas acquis cette collection à la France. In his autobiography, Sayce also recalls with non-emphatic words an episode happened during the International Congress of Orientalists at Stockholm in 1989. Stockholm was crowded with the Orientalists, most of whom were lodged in the Grand Hotel. One of my friends, the Hebrew scholar Ball, occupied a room next to that of the French Assyriology of Père, and complained to me that the latter prevented him from sleeping, as he heard him night after night pacing the floor and repeating, Je suis Oppert de Paris, je suis Oppert. The relationship between Sayce and Oppert, their personal encounters and their confidence, unexpectedly emerges also from the indirect testimony in Sayce's correspondence with other scholars. We quote here, as an example, the postcard of Sayce to the Czech Orientalist Justin Pražek. We thank Šárka Beharčíka for the permission to quote this unpublished document. At the end, my review of your book is in type, but I don't know when it will appear. I will ask the editor to send you a copy of the Academy when it appears, since I may have already left England for Egypt by that time. Oppert was with me a fortnight ago, and we were both admiring your book. Now we leave Oppert, and we continue with the other French friends of Sayce. Besides Oppert, in fact, Sayce was in epistolary contact with many other French scholars. And today we only present some highlights of a narrow selection of the letter kept at Oxford. In one case, however, we only have an indirect information. In the Heroic Age of Assyriology, Sayce mentions his correspondence with Joachim Menand, defined as a gentleman and a faithful friend. Unfortunately, this exchange of letters has been completely lost, at least as far as we know, on Sayce's side at Oxford. Again, this was clearly an important correspondence lasting almost 30 years. It was to be begun in 1972, the year of publication of Sayce's Assyrian grammar, and lasted until 1999, the year of Menand's death. Menand I never saw personally, but we had a good deal of correspondence with one another, beginning with a protest on his part against the judgment of his work, which I had expressed in my Assyrian grammar. But the protest was that of a gentleman, and subsequently found him a faithful friend up to the end of his life. Now we move to Lenormand. In the Heroic Age of Assyriology, another correspondence entertained by Sayce is mentioned. It is the one with François Lenormand. Sayce writes, of François Lenormand I can speak only with affection, mingled with admiration for the wideness of his knowledge and intellectual interest. He was a man of considerable size and stature, and of great vivacity of manner and readiness of speech. He received our bound during the siege of Paris, from which he never fully recovered, and which was eventually the cause of his death. One day I received a letter which began with the words, "I am nailed to the bed and fear that I may never leave it." It was the last letter I received from him. In Lenormand, writes, I see one of the founders of Sumerian grammar. In Say's passive correspondence kept in the Bodleian Library, there are 4 letters from Lenormand, dated between 75 and 80. The letters to which specifically Say refers has not reached us. Let's now read parts of 3 of Lenormand's letter to Say. On May 2, from Rue Taranne, formerly in the 6th arrondissement, 6e arrondissement, then integrated with Boulevard Saint-Germain, Lenormand wrote, Cher Messieurs, vous recevrez d'ici à quelques jours un nouveau volume de moi que je me permets de recommander à votre bienveillante attention. C'est encore un travail sur l'acadien dans lequel je crois avoir posé la question des rapprochements philologiques avec les langues touraniennes plus loin et d'une manière plus méthodique que je ne l'avais encore fait. J'espère que vous en serez content. C'est une réponse aux insanités d'Halévy. Vous serez peut-être étonné que j'y ai attaché autant d'importance. Mais malheureusement, c'était nécessaire en France, où le travail d'Halévy avait fait beaucoup d'effets et où il n'était que l'organe d'une véritable coup montée contre la syriologie et les assyriologues de la part des gens qui occupent de hautes positions scientifiques. C'est là ce qui explique l'insertion d'un travail aussi dénué de valeur dans un recueil de l'importance du journal asiatique. Il importe beaucoup qu'à l'étranger, on en fasse honte au directeur de ce recueil et que les hommes compétents se prononcent hautement sur une polémique plus grave qu'ils n'ont pu le croire d'abord. Aussi, si vous avez l'amabilité de dire quelques mots de mon volume dans l'Académie, je vous serai infiniment reconnaissant de m'envoyer les numéros pour que je puisse les montrer à quelques personnes. Veuillez agréer, cher monsieur, la nouvelle assurance de mes sentiments de bien cordiale confraternité. Et Lenormand, here refers to la langue primitive des Chaldées et les idiomes touraniens. En septembre 9, 1976, from Bossier in the Isère department, Lenormand, who is leaving for Italy, writes to say that he has completed his études sur quelques parties des syllabaires cunéiformes et de philologie acadienne et assyrienne, adding, je sollicite instamment vos observations. Elles ont toujours pour moi le plus grand prix et il s'agit d'un sujet pour lequel vous êtes, en Europe, l'homme le plus compétent. After 2 pages of technicalities, Lenormand regrets the death of Smith and makes an interesting comment on Hopper. Quelle triste nouvelle que celle de la mort de ce pauvre Smith. C'est une bien grande perte pour la science. J'en suis profondément affligé, mais je vais encore en douter. Je n'ai pas encore pu étudier le travail d'Hopper sur les inscriptions susiennes, mais d'après ce que j'en savais par avance, votre jugement ne m'étonne pas. Il doit y avoir dans ce travail des choses très neuves et très ingénieuses, mais aussi des choses trop hardies, des conjectures sans base. C'est un peu comme cela que travaille maintenant Hopper, malgré son immense mérite. Il va vite, se laisse aller à des impressions et ne contrôle pas assez ses conjectures dans des choses où l'on ne peut avancer solidement qu'au prix des constatations les plus minutieuses. 2 years later, writing to Say, still from Bossier, on June 79, Lenormand comments on Hopper's scientific work with these words. Ce que vous me dites de vos constatations dans les nouvelles tablettes astronomiques est bien curieux et bien important. Je ne suis pas surpris du reste de ce que la plupart des identifications d'Hopper étaient trop hâtives et pourtant inexactes. Il y en avait beaucoup qui me paraissent devoir être telles, mais comme je ne suis pas astronome, je m'inclinais. Et venons à Joseph Halévy. Sayce certainly received many letters from Halévy. Halévy lived in 26 rue Homer in the 3e. The Bodleian Library holds 7 of these letters from Paris, sent between May 76 and August 83. Rather long, they are very detailed and full of Assyriological technicalities, often accompanied by comparisons with more recent Semitic languages. Alongside these scientific aspects, there are a number of more general, let us say professional observations. We have selected some of them of interest for the reconstruction of the polemic caused by Halevi's publication, which, as we have seen, led Hopper et Lenormand to write, from the opposite side, very harsh statements and assessments to Sayce. It is clear to us that Halevi is a tragic figure. On March 9, 1978, Halevi wrote to Sayce a long and important letter. Cher monsieur, je m'empresse de vous remercier pour les bienveillants sentiments exprimés dans votre lettre que je reçois à l'instant. Je vois avec plaisir que vous sentez parfaitement que j'ai dû, mais que vous sentez parfaitement ce qu'a dû m'écouter de rompre un visseur avec un homme qu'on considère jusqu'à présent, surtout en Allemagne, comme la plus grande autorité en assyriologie. Vous avez sans doute remarqué que ma critique s'arrête à 1876. Ce que depuis ce temps, j'ai hésité à la publier. J'ai fait plus. Il y a 8 mois, je suis allé offrir la paix à M. Hopper, en lui promettant de supprimer l'article prêt à paraître s'il voulait faire cesser ses attaques provocantes. Non seulement il m'a pris de haut, mais ses injures ont recommencé de plus belle. Ces invectives intolérables m'ont mis dans le cas de défense légitime et je me suis enfin décidé à donner les bons à tirer. Cependant, je me suis abstenu de continuer mes citations jusqu'à son livre récent, livre qui pullule de monstruosités linguistiques, ne pouvant que nuire à la syriologie. Si quelques recueils anglais m'ouvraient ces colonnes, je ferais volontiers la critique de ces livres, en forme mesurée, mais ne dissimulant rien de ce qu'il y a de plat et d'absurde dans les commentaires des textes juridiques. Excusez mon audace pour le service que je vais vous demander. Serez-vous assez bon pour me recommander à la Biblical Archaeological Society comme membre et collaborateur? Plusieurs articles sémitico-assyriens qui dorment dans mes cartons y trouveraient une place convenable et j'aurai l'avantage de recevoir régulièrement ce recueil important. Je suis aussi prêt à collaborer aux Records of the Past si la rédaction voulait accepter mes travaux. Vous savez certainement avec quel dédain M. Delitzsch a procédé plusieurs fois à mon égard. Son dogmatisme commence à devenir blessant même pour ses flatteurs, et tout me dit que l'assyriologie aura bientôt en lui un Hopper numéro 2. J'ai cru devoir rappeler à ces savants la fragilité humaine, et j'espère que vous avez trouvé que mes observations contre les étymologies acadisantes sont quelque peu fondées. Si je me suis trompé, je serais heureux de les voir relevés par un savant compétent, car je ne demande pas mieux que de renoncer aux erreurs. And after a long discussion of the toponym Sumer, Halevi writes, je m'explique très difficilement, je l'avoue en toute humilité, comment un esprit aussi lucide d'Hopper a aussi nourri de la saine méthodologie philologique a pu se laisser entraîner dans cette voie ingrate. La thèse du touranisme n'a plus aucun partisan en Allemagne. Elle est délaissée par Hopper. Lenormand lui-même n'y tient plus. Il est temps que la phonétique acadienne, pour ceux qui croient, soit étudiée indépendamment du mongol et d'autres langues altaïques. After some other technical remarks on the toponym Sumer, Halevi ends his letter in this way. Votre idée sur l'origine de l'écriture cypriote me paraît très vraisemblable. Continuez vos études, c'est un sujet digne de votre sagacité. Ici, nous manquons de moyens pour l'étudier avec des chances de réussir. Veuillez prendre les quelques libertés prises ci-dessus comme marque de la profonde et inaltérable estime que je professe à l'égard de votre science et de votre caractère. Et je vous prie de conserver votre sympathie à votre tout dévoué Halevi. Grâce à Dieu, les yeux ne me font plus mal. Halevi wrote to Sayce another significant letter 2 years later, on July 83. Mon cher ami, permettez-moi d'abord de vous appliquer ce titre ami, qui me rendra plus à l'aise dans l'appréciation de vos objections que vous avez bien voulu m'adresser il y a quelques jours et desquelles je vous remercie infiniment. Je pense que la science ne peut que gagner quand la discussion est menée avec sincérité et par des adversaires qui s'estiment réciproquement, dont la diversité d'opinions laisse leur amitié intacte. Ceci dit, je passe aux faits. Halevi continues with a long discussion of notions of allography and hieratic. Then he writes, vous trouvez hardly fair que j'ai attribué à tous les assyriologues des opinions propres de M. Lenormand seul. Vous oubliez, mon cher ami, que ces opinions sont aussi celles de M. Hopper, la plus grande autorité en fait d'assyriologie. Pour un sentiment que vous appréciez, je l'espère, j'ai évité à dessein de vous combattre et je me suis borné aux assyriologues qui n'admettent pas votre intransigeance panacadiste. Excusez-moi les mots. Vous êtes de l'extrême gauche. Je pense de voir l'expression de Sayce quand il dit qu'il est d'extrême gauche. C'est votre droit. Mais moi, je préférais m'adresser au centre parce que je l'ai cru, le centre, plus enclin à entendre raison. Permettez-moi d'être franc quand je vois que vous ne renoncez même pas entièrement à l'ouralo-altaïsme de l'acadienne, question qui est pourtant parfaitement vidée aujourd'hui. Comment vous voulez-vous que je conçoive la moindre espérance de vous convertir à mon hypothèse hiératique quand vous affirmez que les diverses ethnies qui habitaient la Chaldée, cette patrie des Hébreux et des Araméennes, étaient des non-sémites, quand, malgré la restriction du nombre des Soumères et d'Akkad à la Babylonie seule, vous soutenez l'existence des Akkadiennes en Assyrie, eh bien, mon cher ami, un tel parti pris ne se discute pas, et le consentement de Delitzsch et de Haupt ne modifiera pas ma pénible impression. Moi, je n'ai pas honte d'avouer mes erreurs. Halevi continues discussing inter alia the Achaemenids, the Semites of Babylonia, the Phoenicians, the Arabians, the Ethiopians, the Bible. Et dans cette lettre. Et nous terminons maintenant avec François Thureau d'Angers. In the Bodleian Library, there are 3 letters written to Sayce by Thureau d'Angers. Thureau d'Angers, 33 years old when Hopper died. The 2 letters of May and June 1912, which Thureau d'Angers wrote from Paris, when he lived in 102 rue de Grenelle, dans le 7e, concern Assyriological technicalities related to Urartu in Neo-Assyrian texts. Thureau d'Angers thanks Sayce for having sent him some of his publication. The brief letter sent to Sayce on February 29 expresses a different kind of thanks. In this missive, the most recent one that we present today, the 57-year-old Thureau d'Angers, who has not changed his house, so writes to the 84-year-old English scholar. Cher monsieur, je sais par Langdon que je dois pour une grande part à votre bienveillant intérêt l'insigne honneur d'avoir été désigné pour recevoir le titre de docteur honoris causa de l'Université d'Oxford. Et j'ai à cœur de vous en adresser tous mes remerciements bien sincères. Je tiens pour un rare privilège d'être agrégé à votre illustre université. Je compte me rendre à Oxford le 16 juin. J'espère que j'aurai le grand plaisir de vous y rencontrer. Veuillez, je vous prie, cher monsieur, agréer l'expression de mes sentiments respectueux et reconnaissants. Et avec ça, nous avons terminé.